Welcome back to Talking Trade. I'm Sandy Siegel, president of Emmy Day.
And I'm Ian Coxhead at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And we all know that foreign policy often drives trade policy for individual countries. Today's speaker is an expert, an authority on the interaction between foreign policy and trade policy, Ngosong Fonkem, an international trade lawyer with Page Fura PC in Chicago. And also the author of a recent book, Trade Crash, a primer on surviving and thriving in pandemics and global trade disruptions. There's the book. We'll hear more about that in just a moment. So Ngosong, I want to ask, first of all, very generally, you've described in a recent blog post, you've described the Biden administration's foreign policy as centered on human rights. So how do we see this, and how in general would you say that affects their trade policy measures?
Thank you, Ian, for inviting me to your show. And before I actually even answer your question, I'd like to make a quick disclaimer that the views expressed by me today are my own and do not necessarily represent those of my law firm or some of my clients. Now, to get back to your question, when you study trade history, I think the one constant you will often find is that trade policy and foreign policy oftentimes intertwine with foreign policy tailored to promote trade interests. From a US perspective, which is of interest to us, for example, over the last 100 years or so, when the US government has oftentimes entered into trade negotiations, they've done so under the assumption that open markets essentially fosters democracy, which in turn promotes world peace. In fact, trade policy has been the bedrock of US foreign policy since World War II. So I think it's within this framework that we should look at Biden's human rights centered foreign policy. I personally believe it's really a democracy promotion policy anchored on human rights, workers' rights, environmental rights, et cetera, with the goal to promote US trade interests. So what does that policy essentially mean for a Wisconsin business that's engaged in international trade? I personally believe, ironically, that the policy itself continues President Trump's America First tough approach to handling trade disputes. So if anyone had been expecting a significant change on the trade front, I think they've certainly been disappointed so far. As you all know well, the tariffs are still here.
Yep.
And the US government is continuing to enforce, strictly enforce US trade laws against trading partners. I think the only thing that has changed so far is really just the tone at the top and the strategy itself.
So just the motivation rather than the policies themselves.
Exactly.
Right. Interesting. I certainly, support all the human rights issues and doing that politically. I've also got, the business perspective of things and the challenges for businesses. For the importers we represent as customs brokers, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of these forced labor, withhold release orders and so forth that are being imposed. I have some personal experience for clients of mine that have been impacted on goods being detained, which can be lengthy, expensive, and obviously disruptive. And the burden is on the importer, as you know, to prove that goods that they source are not directly related in the supply chain to any of the suppliers or manufacturers that are presumed to be, in employing forced labor and so forth. But that can be really challenging. And there's some industries like palm oil and, the Uyghur area and cotton, manufacturers where it's really hard to go all the way back in the sourcing to make sure that your supplier doesn't have any connections, with some of these companies that are violators. How, as an attorney, what advice can you offer in for importers that are impacted by these products and the various withhold release orders imposed on being proactive, you know, doing their homework, doing their due diligence on sourcing and so forth?
Oh, I think, Sandy, that's a very good question. So the US government has accused the Chinese government of, I guess, committing cultural genocide, which obviously the Chinese government denies it. And as you know well, that actually has implications on the trade side. So bearing that in mind, I think we often advise most of our clients to essentially remain vigilant and to track and monitor ongoing developments that could impact their business. And we know, as you eloquently stated, that based on the trade actions that has been taken so far by the US government, we will likely see more scrutiny on transactions that could be deemed by the US government to have used forced labor or could be used to violate essentially human rights. So from a sourcing importing perspective, we would typically advise our clients to evaluate their entire supply chain to ensure that their products were not produced using forced labor. In some cases, we've even advised some of our clients to consider shifting their manufacturing operations outside of highly sensitive areas or areas that the US government believe are quite sensitive to some of the forced labor issues like Xinjiang or Malaysia, for example, with the gloves, or palm oil. As a matter of fact, is a major commodity in West Africa. That's also an area of sensitivity. But obviously, for example, if China is a big market for you, that's probably not a good option, I believe, because you run the risk of retaliation on the importing side into China. And I've also heard that the Chinese government is thinking about implementing what they call the anti-sanctions laws, which basically just means if you comply with US sanctions against Chinese companies, you are essentially violating Chinese laws. So that could be a big headache for US companies with major significant operations in China. So they would basically have to remain vigilant on that. Now, from an export perspective, for example, they should, again, continue to review and update their exporting process to ensure that they do not inadvertently export without the necessary export license or export to a sanctioned entity or companies or so. So, and most of these companies, most of the companies are already doing most of these things. They just have to essentially remain more vigilant.
Right. Well, I think your advice on sourcing elsewhere is sometimes the easiest because, you know, as I understand, sometimes everything funnels back to a couple of key manufacturers in an area, and it's really hard to, you know, as an importer to be certain your goods don't somehow, you know, aren't relative to that. So thank you for that.
I agree.
We have just a minute or two left. Ngosong, can you tell us about your book? I'm interested in that and share some, you know, some of your key points in that. And
can you see?
That is, yeah, we see it.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
An actual book.
Yeah, it is hardcover. So when we started writing this book, myself and my co-author Bruce Aiken, that I used to work for a long time ago, I mean, our goal was to essentially inform the business community of the drivers of the international trading system. I mean, the book was really written as a result of the so-called Trump's trade war with China. So, and then COVID-19 came and caused so much damage to the international trading environment that we felt that any book on trade disruption needed to at least include a chapter on COVID-19. So we spent the earlier part of I would say, life observing the impact of COVID-19 on the US economies and that of other countries. And the risk management strategies that they deployed to sort of manage the pandemic. And our goal then, even now, always still remain the same, that even if we were to find a vaccine on COVID-19, trade disruption will essentially not go away anytime soon. In fact, there have been so many different vaccines now in the market. And in fact, we actually always believe that trade disruptions will essentially continue to increase, especially given the geopolitical tension between the US and China, which are the two largest economies in the world at this particular moment, as they continue to compete for global leadership in economics and technology. So any companies that operate within that international trading environment must essentially have a plan on how to manage trade risk, whether that risk is business risk, cultural risk, political risk, but they should really have a plan. And in the book, we provided a number of strategies to help the business community do just that.
Excellent. I look forward to reading it. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Ngosong. And a gloomy prospect. I guess it sounds like the trade war pandemic is going to last just as long as the real one.
Well, I mean, it might, but I think we should always be hopeful, right? I mean, so long as the competition does not become kinetic, I think that's a good thing for all of us here. So.
Thank you. Good to end on a high note. So thanks, Ngosong. Really good talking to you, and we'll look forward to seeing you again. This has been Talking Trade. Look forward to seeing you all again in the next episode. Bye now.
Thank you.